A millionaire buys a little boy from a poor family, but when he sees the mark on his leg, he freezes upon discovering who he is. Amid the incessant noise of the streets of Brooklyn, a heartbreaking scream cut through the air. "Please let me go, I won't do it again." Sir Gabriel Anderson, who was passing by on his way to a meeting, stopped when he heard the lament. His eyes found the scene. A man, rough and weathered by life, was holding a boy no older than 8 with brutality. The little boy, with a dirty face and trembling hands, held a half-empty box of sweets as he tried to break free from the man's grip. The man yelled angrily, calling him useless and threatening something worse if he didn't sell everything before going home. The rest of the passers-by continued on without looking, perhaps accustomed to the harshness of the area. Gabriel, however, could not ignore what he saw. There was something in the boy's eyes, a mix of resignation and suffering, that hit him like a punch in the stomach. "Let him go right now," Gabriel said, walking firmly towards the scene. His voice, full of authority, made the man release the boy immediately, though he looked at him with disdain. "What do you care? This brat is my son, and I'm teaching him how to earn a living. Or are you going to take care of him?" the man replied sarcastically, crossing his arms. Gabriel took a deep breath, trying to control his growing anger, and looked down at the boy, who was still clutching his box of sweets, his eyes wet and lips tight. "Is it true he's your son?" Gabriel asked calmly, although his tone carried an unspoken warning. The man shrugged. "Of course he is, though it seems he's good for nothing, not even for selling a few measly sweets. If he doesn't help me, who's going to feed the family?" His voice was filled with bitterness. Gabriel noticed that the man's words lacked any trace of love or paternal concern. There was something dark and opportunistic in his attitude. Gabriel then made a decision that even seemed irrational at that moment. "If you're so bothered by the boy, tell me how much you want for him," he said bluntly. The man looked at him, his eyes wide open, confused at first, but soon a cynical smile appeared on his face. "What kind of game is this? Are you telling me you want to buy him? Come on, don't make me laugh," he mocked. Gabriel reached into his jacket pocket and pulled out a wad of bills, holding them up for the man to see. "I'm not joking. Tell me your price and let him go. Starting today, you won't have to worry about this boy ever again." The man stopped laughing when he saw the money. His eyes gleamed with greed, and his attitude completely changed. "Well, if you want him, it'll cost you. How does 1,000 pesos sound?" Gabriel didn't hesitate. He counted the bills in front of the man, folded the wad, and handed it over. "1,000 pesos, but I want your word that you won't come looking for him again." "Of course, sir. I don't even care. Take him, and good luck with him," said the man, putting the money in his pocket and quickly walking away, as if afraid Gabriel might change his mind. The boy, still silent, looked at Gabriel with a mixture of fear and confusion. "What are you going to do with me?" he asked in a trembling voice. Gabriel crouched down to his height. "I'm going to take you to a place where you'll be safe. You won't have to worry about him anymore, trust me." The boy nodded weakly, as if he had no energy to argue, and let Gabriel guide him to a black car waiting on the corner. As they drove away, Gabriel glanced at the boy in the rearview mirror. The boy sat in silence, clutching his box of sweets as if it were the only thing he had in the world. Gabriel's black car stopped in front of the imposing iron gates, marking the entrance to his mansion. The sunset light reflected in the windows of the house, which seemed more like a palace than a home. The boy, sitting silently next to Gabriel, stared at the building with wide eyes. It was the first time he had ever seen something so large, so clean, so far from the streets where he had spent his whole life. Gabriel turned off the engine and turned his head toward the boy. "We're here. This will be your home now," he said, in a firm yet noticeably contained voice. Michael didn't respond, still holding onto his box of sweets as if it were his only shield against an unknown world. Gabriel sighed, opened the door, and got out of the car as a uniformed man exited the mansion to greet him. "Welcome back, Mr. Anderson," the butler said, bowing slightly. But his gaze stopped on Michael, clearly surprised by the presence of the boy. Before he could ask, Gabriel spoke in an authoritative tone. "This is Michael. He will stay here with us. Make sure they prepare a room for him." The butler, accustomed to his employer's eccentricities, simply nodded and opened the rear door of the car. Michael hesitated for a moment before getting out. His small figure seemed even more fragile in front of the mansion's enormous size. Inside the mansion, the atmosphere was silent and opulent. Every corner was decorated with art pieces, Persian rugs, and carved wooden furniture. Michael walked with uncertain steps, feeling as though every movement was a mistake in that place. Gabriel walked a few steps ahead of him, seemingly indifferent to the boy's discomfort. In the foyer, a middle-aged woman in an immaculate apron hurried out when she heard the noise. It was Mrs. Wilson, the housekeeper, a woman with a stern expression but deeply loyal to Gabriel. When she saw the boy, her eyes narrowed slightly as she quickly assessed him. "What's this, Sir Gabriel?" she asked with a neutral tone, though her gaze showed curiosity. "This is Michael. He will stay with us," Gabriel replied without stopping. His voice didn't invite further questions. However, Mrs. Wilson couldn't help but notice the state of the boy. His clothes were dirty, his shoes worn, and there was a sadness in his eyes that felt familiar. "Are you hungry, boy?" she asked finally, softening her tone a little. Michael looked up at her as if unsure whether it was okay to answer. He finally nodded almost imperceptibly. "Take him to the kitchen. Have them prepare something for him to eat," Gabriel ordered before heading toward the stairs. "I'll be in my office." Mrs. Wilson watched as Gabriel quickly climbed the stairs, almost as if he wanted to escape the situation. Then she looked at Michael and gestured for him to follow her. "Come on, little one, let's get you something to eat." In the kitchen, the staff stopped when they saw the boy, exchanging surprised glances. It wasn't common for Mr. Gabriel to bring visitors, and even less common for it to be a child. While Michael ate a bowl of hot soup, Mrs. Wilson sat across from him. "So, you're staying here?" she asked in a gentler tone. "I don't know," Michael murmured, staring at his spoon. "He didn't tell me anything." Renata watched him silently. There was something about the boy that moved her. Although she wasn't sure what it was, when Michael finished eating, Mrs. Wilson took him to a small but comfortable room where clean clothes and a new bed had already been set up. "This will be your room," she said. "If you need anything, you can call me." Michael looked at the room with uncertainty. He had never had a space just for himself. "Thank you," he said softly. Meanwhile, in his office, Gabriel poured himself a glass of whiskey and gazed out the window at the gardens. "If you're watching up to this point, I'm sure you're liking it, so I want to ask you to subscribe to the channel," Gabriel said to himself. The first morning at the Anderson mansion began with an eerie stillness. Michael, still adjusting to his new reality, woke up early in his new room. The bed was more comfortable than he had ever imagined, but the weight of the unknown still pressed on him. He got up slowly and looked out the window at the perfectly manicured gardens. For a moment, he thought it was all a dream, and he would soon wake up. At the dining table, Gabriel was already sitting, reading a newspaper while drinking his coffee. His rigid posture and focused gaze on the pages showed his evident discomfort. He wasn't used to having another person in his routine, let alone a child. When he heard Michael's light footsteps, he folded the newspaper and set it aside. "Come sit," he said, pointing to the chair across from him. Michael approached cautiously, looking at the table full of food. Fresh bread, fruits, milk, things he had only seen in store windows. He sat down without saying anything and began to timidly pour himself a glass of milk. Gabriel observed him, searching for the right words. He had spent the whole night thinking about how to approach the boy, but his own emotional awkwardness made it difficult to know where to start. "Did you sleep well?" he finally asked, his tone softer than usual. "Yes," Michael murmured without looking up. "What did you use to have for breakfast?" Gabriel pressed, trying to start a conversation. "Bread. When I had it," Michael replied after a pause. Silence filled the room again. Gabriel felt like the wall between them was impenetrable, but he didn't want to give up. "Michael," he said finally, leaning slightly forward, "now you're here with me. You don't have to worry about anything. I want you to feel safe." The boy nodded, but his expression remained distant. "Thank you," he said, though his tone conveyed resignation more than gratitude. Later, Gabriel decided to dedicate the day to being with Michael. He cancelled all his meetings and asked to be left alone with the boy. He took him to the garden, showing him the fountains and flower-lined paths. He tried to talk about the fruit trees growing there, but Michael seemed distracted, lost in his own thoughts. Finally, as they were walking, Gabriel stopped and crouched down to Michael's level. "Michael, I want to get to know you better. What do you like to do? What makes you happy?" Michael hesitated before responding. "I don't know. I didn't have many things to do. Sometimes I played with a ball I found in the street, but it broke." Gabriel felt a knot form in his throat. He didn't know how to handle the reality of the boy's lack of things. "Here, you'll have whatever you need. If you want a ball, we can get you a new one." The boy shook his head. "It's not that. It's that I don't want him to get angry." "Who?" Gabriel asked, furrowing his brow. "The man. He said I couldn't play, that I had to sell, and if he saw me playing he would punish me. He said I was useless, especially because of my leg." The mention of his leg caught Gabriel's attention. "What's wrong with your leg?" he asked, though his tone tried not to sound alarmed. Michael lowered his gaze, uncomfortable. "I have a mark. He said it wasn't normal, that it made me different." "Let me see it," Gabriel asked, leaning a little closer. Michael hesitated, but finally lifted his pants slightly, revealing a crescent-shaped scar on his calf. Gabriel froze, his eyes fixed on the scar. For a moment, time seemed to stand still. Something about that mark shook him deeply, though he couldn't explain why. It was as if he were seeing a fragment of his own past, something buried long ago. Michael noticed his reaction and quickly lowered his pants. "It doesn't matter. It doesn't hurt anymore," he said nervously. Gabriel straightened up, still processing what he had seen. "There's nothing wrong with you, Michael," he finally said, though his voice was filled with contained emotions. "That mark doesn't mean anything bad. Don't let anyone make you feel less because of it." Michael looked at him, searching for some sign of sincerity in his words. For the first time, he seemed to relax slightly. Gabriel remained in his office, sitting in front of his desk, staring at a glass of whiskey he hadn't touched. The image of the scar on Michael's leg continued to haunt his mind. He couldn't shake the sense of familiarity it gave him. There was something about the shape, the exact location of the scar, that felt eerily familiar. He suddenly stood up, as if the movement could clear his thoughts, and walked over to a glass display case in the corner of the room. Inside were items from his past that he had never dared to discard. Old photographs, a watch from his father, and a small leather album that he hadn't opened in years. He took it in trembling hands and sat down in a nearby armchair. As he flipped through the pages of the album, he found what he was looking for: a black and white photograph of himself at age 10. He was sitting in a hospital with his right leg in a cast and a forced smile on his face. He had forgotten that day, or perhaps he had repressed it. It was an accident in the backyard of his house, a fall while playing near the shed. The result had been a crescent-shaped scar, which, though almost imperceptible now, had been a source of shame in his childhood. Gabriel set the photo aside and rubbed his temples, trying to rationalize what he was feeling. "It's just a coincidence," he said aloud, Though the unease inside him continued to grow, what were the chances that this boy, who had appeared out of nowhere, would have the exact same mark? A knock at the door pulled him out of his thoughts. It was Mrs. Wilson, entering with her usual efficiency. "Excuse me, Sir Gabriel, but the boy is in the garden. He says he wants to see you." Gabriel nodded and left the album on the desk. Before following her, he went outside to find Michael sitting on the grass, staring intently at a flower he held between his fingers. His expression was calm, but there was a melancholy in his posture that Gabriel couldn't ignore. "What are you doing here, Michael?" he asked as he approached. "I was thinking," the boy replied without looking at him. "Before, when I lived with them, there were no flowers. Everything was grey." Gabriel sat beside him, feeling uncomfortable with the weight of the conversation. "Here, you won't have to worry about that. You can have all the flowers you want." Michael smiled weakly, but his expression quickly changed as he looked at his leg. "Is it because of my mark?" he suddenly asked. Gabriel felt a knot in his stomach. "What do you mean?" "The man always said my mark was strange, that I shouldn't have it. That's why sometimes he told me I wasn't worth anything." Gabriel clenched his fists, holding back the anger he felt toward the man who had treated the boy so cruelly. "Your mark is nothing wrong, Michael. It's just a scar. I have one too," he confessed, the words coming out before he could stop them. Michael looked up, surprised. "Really?" Gabriel nodded, lifting his pant leg just enough to show the faint mark on his calf, though it had almost faded with the years. The shape was unmistakable. "It's the same," said Michael, touching his own leg. "How did you get it?" Gabriel responded, trying to sound casual. "It was an accident when I was about your age, but it doesn't mean anything, Michael. Don't let anyone make you feel less because of it." However, as he spoke those words, Gabriel knew that he couldn't convince himself. The coincidence was too perfect. Something inside him told him that he had to investigate further. That night, once Michael was asleep, Gabriel sat again at his desk. He called his lawyer, Javier, and asked for an unusual favor. "I need you to gather all the information possible about that boy, medical records, family details, anything." Javier, though surprised, accepted without asking questions. Gabriel sat in his office, surrounded by a silence that felt heavier than usual. On the desk in front of him was the envelope the supposed family of Michael had given him the day they agreed to sell the boy. He had postponed reviewing those papers, but the doubts that had plagued his mind since he saw the scar on Michael's leg wouldn't let him rest. Something in the entire situation didn't add up, and Gabriel knew that only by confronting the truth could he understand what was really going on. He took the envelope with steady hands, but as he opened it, a chill ran down his spine. Inside was a birth certificate, a medical certificate, and a letter supposedly written by Michael's father. Gabriel began to review the documents one by one, studying them with the same precision he used when analyzing multi-million-dollar contracts. The birth certificate was the first thing that caught his attention. The paper was clearly aged intentionally, the edges worn, but the text had obvious inconsistencies. The dates didn't match. Michael should have been born 1 year, but the signature of the civil registry officer was dated 2 years later. Gabriel frowned, carefully setting the document aside. The next paper was a medical report. According to this, Michael had been treated for a severe respiratory illness at a local clinic. However, the formal tone of the report contrasted with the awkwardness in its writing. Moreover, the name of the clinic seemed familiar, but not for good reasons. He knew that the place had been linked to questionable practices, including the falsification of medical documents. Finally, Gabriel took the letter. The language was simple, as if written by someone with little education, and it described the father's inability to care for Michael due to his economic situation. Though it tried to convey emotion, there was something mechanical about the words, as if the author had no real connection to the boy. Gabriel placed the letter on the desk and leaned back in his chair. Everything in those papers pointed to a fabrication. Michael had not only been abandoned, but he had likely been used as a pawn in something darker. He took a deep breath, letting the anger settle. He knew what he had to do: confront that family and demand the truth. He picked up his phone and called Javier, his trusted lawyer. "I need you to confirm the validity of some documents. I want you to investigate the origin of a birth certificate and a medical certificate. I'll send the copies over by email right now." "Understood, Sir Gabriel. Is there anything else I should know?" Javier asked, sensing the tense tone in his voice. "Yes, I want to make sure these papers are thoroughly examined. Something tells me we're dealing with a well-crafted lie." After hanging up, Gabriel stood from his chair and walked toward the window. The mansion, normally a refuge of tranquility, now seemed filled with shadows. He looked out at the gardens, where Michael was playing alone, unaware of the doubts that surrounded his story. Gabriel returned to his desk, put the documents back in the envelope, and held it for a moment before locking it in a drawer. He knew he would have to confront those responsible face to face. Only then would he get answers, though he feared what those answers might reveal. Gabriel arrived in the Brooklyn neighborhood early the next morning, determined to get answers. He had spent the whole night reviewing the falsified documents, and each new inconsistency fueled his indignation. He was not a man accustomed to uncertainty, especially not being deceived. He parked his car at a discreet corner and walked toward the alley where he had first found Michael. The place was as degraded as he remembered. Makeshift stands were already being set up, and the smell of garbage mixed with dampness filled the air. Gabriel walked with firm steps toward the house where he had seen the man who claimed to be Michael's father. He knocked loudly on the door, drawing the attention of some curious onlookers. A few seconds later, the door opened, and the man appeared, still sleepy and clearly confused by his presence. "What are you doing here?" he asked distrustfully, scratching his neck. "We need to talk," Gabriel said, his voice contained but threatening. Without waiting for an invitation, he pushed the door open and entered the small house. The interior was as miserable as he had imagined: peeling walls, a mattress on the floor, and a rickety table with dirty plates. A woman stepped out from another room, looking with the same mixture of fear and surprise. "I want to know the truth about Michael," Gabriel demanded, turning to the man, "and I'm not leaving here until you tell me who you really are." The man exchanged a nervous glance with the woman and tried to evade the question, but Gabriel interrupted with a sharp slam on the table, causing the dishes to shake. "No more lies. I know those documents are fake. Where did you get the boy from?" The woman, visibly uncomfortable, stepped forward. "Okay, no need to make a scene," she murmured, glancing at the man with reproach. Then she turned to Gabriel, sighing deeply. "We're not his parents, if that's what you want to know. We picked him up a few years ago." Gabriel felt his fury mix with disbelief. "You picked him up from where?" "From an orphanage," the woman confessed, lowering her gaze. "They gave him to us without many questions. They said they could fix the paperwork as long as we didn't complain. And well, we needed help. He was small, but he could work." "Work?" Gabriel repeated, his voice full of disdain. "You used a child as labor?" The man, feeling cornered, raised his hands in defense. "Look, we're not bad people. We were just trying to survive. No one cared about that brat in the orphanage. At least here, he had a roof over his head." Gabriel felt his blood boil. Every word he heard filled him with more indignation. But before he could respond, a soft noise caught his attention. He turned his head toward the slightly open door, and his heart sank when he saw Michael standing there, listening to everything. The boy's face was pale, his eyes full of unshed tears. Gabriel didn't know how long he had been there, but it was clear that he had heard enough. "Michael," the man started, but the boy stepped back, shaking his head. "They're not my parents," he whispered, barely audible. "Michael, let me explain." Gabriel tried, stepping closer to him, but the boy took another step back, bumping into the wall. "Why didn't they want me? Why did they leave me?" The words came out in a rush, filled with pain. The woman took a step forward, trying to calm him. "Michael, it's not that we didn't want you. Don't touch me!" The boy screamed before running out the door and into the street. Gabriel reacted immediately, chasing after him. He caught up to Michael at a corner where the boy had collapsed to his knees, sobbing uncontrollably. Gabriel knelt beside him, feeling a pain he didn't know how to express. "Michael, look at me. What those people did doesn't define who you are. You are worth so much more than that, do you understand?" Michael didn't answer, but he allowed Gabriel to embrace him. For the first time, Gabriel felt that his duty wasn't just to protect the boy, but to heal the wounds others had left on him. Night fell over the Anderson mansion, enveloping every corner in an unsettling silence. Michael, lying in his bed, couldn't fall asleep. His mind was filled with questions he couldn't answer, images of the words he had heard that morning in Brooklyn. His chest felt heavy, as if the air were insufficient in that room, which, though luxurious, felt alien to him. He got up carefully, trying not to make noise. His small, bare feet touched the cold floor as he moved toward the window. Outside, the garden stretched under the dim light of the moon, a place that, at another time, might have seemed magical, but now was just a reminder of how far he was from everything he knew. Michael made a decision. He couldn't stay there any longer. No matter how hard Gabriel tried to show him affection, he couldn't ignore the feeling that he didn't belong. "No one really wants me," he murmured to himself as he gathered his few belongings. A spare shirt Mrs. Wilson had given him and a small wooden figurine he had found in the garden. With his heart racing, he stepped into the hallway. The mansion was in shadows, and every creak of the floor under his feet made him stop, holding his breath. He passed by Gabriel's office, whose door was ajar. Inside, he saw the man asleep in his chair, an empty glass on the table. Michael felt a slight tug in his chest, seeing him so vulnerable, but he quickly pushed the thought aside. "He doesn't understand me either," he told himself, and continued toward the stairs. When he reached the front entrance, he found the massive iron gate locked. He cursed his lack of foresight and decided to look for another way out. He circled around the main hall and reached a side door that led to the garden. To his relief, it was unlocked. He carefully opened it and stepped outside, feeling the cool air on his face. He ran toward the garden's limits, where the high walls seemed impossible to scale. However, Michael found a tree with branches that extended far enough to allow him to climb. With effort and fear, he managed to reach the top of the wall, and from there jumped to the other side, landing clumsily on the ground. Ignoring the pain in his knees, he got up and started running without looking back. Inside the mansion, Gabriel woke up abruptly, as if some instinct had alerted him. He looked around, confused at first, but something inside him told him that something was wrong. He quickly got up and walked through the house, calling Michael's name softly. When he received no answer, panic began to invade him. He checked the boy's room and found the empty bed, the blanket wrinkled and the curtains of the window fluttering slightly. "Michael!" he shouted as he ran toward the garden. Desperation pushed him to search every corner until he saw the marks in the dirt by the wall and the broken branches of the tree. Without wasting another moment, he opened the main gate and rushed out in his car, scanning the darkness for the boy. It didn't take long to find him. Michael was sitting on the sidewalk, hugging himself, his face buried in his knees. Gabriel stopped the car and got out, running toward him. "Michael," he said. His voice choked as he knelt before the boy. "What are you doing here? Why did you leave?" Michael lifted his head, and Gabriel could see the tears rolling down his face. "I don't belong here. I'm nobody. No one wants me. I was just a burden to them. And I will be to you too." Gabriel's heart broke at those words. Without saying anything, he hugged him tightly, ignoring the boy's initial resistance. "Michael, I will never let anyone hurt you again. I promise. You are important to me, and I don't care what anyone says or what happened before. You have a place here." Michael, still doubtful, slowly gave in to the embrace. Gabriel took him back to the mansion, and that night he stayed seated next to his bed until the boy finally fell asleep. The Anderson mansion had many secrets, and Michael, more and more comfortable exploring his new surroundings, had begun to notice details that he had overlooked before. Although his relationship with Gabriel remained tense, the man made an effort every day to show him that he was safe now. Still, Michael felt out of place, as if none of it belonged to him. One afternoon, while playing in the hallway of the second floor, his eyes fixed on a closed door at the end of the corridor. Unlike the others, this door seemed like it hadn't been opened in a long time. Dust had accumulated on the frame, and the lock showed signs of rust. Intrigued, Michael approached and turned the handle, but it was locked. Curiosity, one of the few things that still kept him restless but alive, pushed him to act. He waited until night, when everyone in the house was busy or asleep, and returned to the spot with a hairpin he had found in Mrs. Wilson's bathroom. After several awkward attempts, he heard a faint click as the lock gave way, and Michael pushed the door open carefully, feeling he was about to discover something important. The air inside the room was cold and heavy, as if time had stopped there. The room was filled with furniture covered in sheets, stacked boxes, and a smell of old wood. Michael lit an oil lamp he found on a table, casting dancing shadows on the walls. Among the faded objects, something caught his attention, a wooden easel with a portrait covered by a cloth. He approached slowly, his heart racing. He carefully removed the cloth and found himself face to face with a painting of a young woman. She had dark, curly hair, and her eyes seemed full of life, as though she were looking directly at him. In her arms, she held a baby wrapped in a blanket, whose expression was serene. But what truly froze Michael was the scar on the baby's leg, identical to his. He stepped back, still staring at the painting, his mind struggling to process what he was seeing. Who was that woman? And why did the baby have the same mark as him? His breath quickened, and without realizing it, he knocked over a vase, which fell to the ground with a crash. The noise woke Gabriel, who rushed down from the third floor. Upon entering the room, he found Michael holding the lamp, trembling, his eyes wide. Gabriel looked at the portrait, and the weight of the past hit him all at once. "Michael, what are you doing here?" he asked, though his voice lacked the harshness. "Who is she?" Michael asked, pointing to the portrait. "Why does the baby have my mark?" Michael asked, his voice trembling. Gabriel stayed silent for a moment, gazing at the painting. His eyes filled with a sadness Michael had never seen before. Finally, he approached and knelt beside him. "She is Emily," Gabriel began, his voice barely a whisper. "She was very important to me, my great love." He paused and then with difficulty continued. "The baby in her arms was supposed to be our son." Michael furrowed his brow, trying to understand. "Supposed to be? What happened to him?" Gabriel averted his gaze, struggling against the emotions threatening to overwhelm him. "There was an accident. It happened many years ago. Emily and I were planning to get married. Everything was ready. But one day while I was away, there was a fire at her house. When I arrived, I was told that she survived, but our son, he had died." Michael didn't know what to say. The silence stretched on, heavy and thick, broken only by the faint creak of the lamp. Gabriel's voice returned, a distant echo. "I always thought that scar was unique," he continued, looking at Michael's leg. "But now that I see you, I can't help but wonder, did I really lose him that day?" The words hung in the air, filled with doubt and unspoken emotions. Michael stood still, his mind swirling in a whirlwind of thoughts. For the first time, he felt that perhaps, just perhaps, there was something bigger behind everything that had happened to him. Gabriel stayed awake that night, seated at his desk, the image of Emily and the baby still etched in his mind. Every time he closed his eyes, the scar on the boy's leg came back with intensity, bringing with it a torrent of memories and unanswered questions. Years had passed, burying the pain of that loss, accepting the official version of events, but now everything was in doubt. At dawn, Gabriel made a decision. If he wanted to uncover the truth, he would need to revisit every detail of that dark chapter of his life. He pulled a wooden box down from a high shelf. It was old and covered in dust, but contained the remnants of that time, letters, photos, and some documents related to his son's birth. The first place he searched was the clinic where Emily had given birth. As he remembered, it was a small private hospital located in a residential neighborhood. Gabriel, who had always trusted the best for his family, had never questioned the choice of that place. But now, with the years that had passed, he wondered if it had truly been as reliable as he had believed. He made a quick call to Javier, his lawyer. "I need you to get access to the records of the Riverside Clinic," he said, not explaining much. Javier, though surprised by the request, didn't ask any questions and promised to get what he could. While waiting, Gabriel decided to search online for any information that might shed light on the place. What he found was unsettling. In old forums and forgotten newspaper articles, he discovered mentions of the clinic, vague accusations of irregularities. There were stories of poorly handled records, suspicious changes in birth certificates, and, most disturbing of all, rumors of baby trafficking. The word trafficking hit him like a hammer. He jumped up from the screen as though just reading it could contaminate him. He walked around the room, running his hands over his face, trying to process what he had found. Could that same clinic have been involved in the disappearance of his son? Hours later, Javier called him back. "Gabriel, I have something, but it's not much. The clinic closed more than a decade ago, and most of the records were destroyed in a fire. Is there anything I can recover?" "Is there any information on the birth certificate change?" Gabriel asked, his voice heavy with frustration. "I found some partial records in a public health office. I'm looking through them now. It seems there was a strange change in your son's birth certificate right after the fire at Emily House." Gabriel clenched the phone tightly, feeling like every word confirmed his worst fears. "Keep investigating. I don't care how long it takes." That afternoon, Gabriel decided to visit the old building of the clinic, now abandoned. Upon arrival, he found a dilapidated structure with broken windows and graffiti covering the walls. He entered cautiously, exploring the empty hallways, searching for anything that could connect this place to the fate of his son. In a back office, among piles of yellowed papers and broken furniture, he found a file that had escaped the fire. It was a birth register from that year. With trembling hands, he searched for Emily's name. He found it, but what confused him was a handwritten note next to the record. "Transferred, pending authorization." "Transferred," he murmured, his heart racing. "Transferred to where?" There was no further information. Gabriel stood at the door, looking in on Michael from the crack in the room. The boy was sitting on the floor, playing with a wooden figurine he had found in the garden, absorbed in his little world. There was something in his expression, a mix of innocence and melancholy, that made Gabriel's chest tighten. He couldn't shake the feeling that this child might be his son, but he needed proof. He decided it was time to act. That night, when Michael was asleep, Gabriel entered the room silently. He approached the bed cautiously, watching as the boy breathed deeply, his face relaxed in sleep. With firm but gentle hands, Gabriel took a comb that Michael had used and removed a few strands of hair that had become caught in the bristles. It would be enough for the analysis he needed. The next day, Gabriel took the sample to a private lab. It was a discreet place known for its speed and confidentiality. "I want a comparative analysis," he explained to the technician, handing over a sample of his own saliva as well. "I need to know if there's a family connection." "The results will be ready in 5 days," the technician replied without asking further questions. Those 5 days seemed like an eternity to Gabriel. Every free moment was spent watching Michael, searching for similarities in the way he spoke, moved, even in the small gestures that might suggest a link between them. As he did, he realized that whether or not there was proof, his attachment to the boy had grown immensely. Meanwhile, Michael began to notice a change in Gabriel. The emotional barriers that had once seemed insurmountable started to crumble. One afternoon, while Gabriel was reviewing some documents in his office, Michael appeared in the doorway with a timid expression. "Uncle Gabriel," he said, his voice barely audible. Gabriel looked up, surprised not only by the tone but by the words. It was the first time Michael had called him that. "Yes," Gabriel responded, setting the papers aside. "Can I stay here with you?" Michael asked, fiddling with the edges of his shirt. Gabriel smiled slightly and gestured to the armchair next to him. "Of course. Come on." Michael sat in the armchair, holding his wooden figurine as if it were a talisman. They remained in comfortable silence for a while, almost as if it were a familiar silence. Finally, Michael spoke. "Sometimes I think about what those people in Brooklyn told me, that I wasn't important, that I was only good for working. But here I don't feel that way." Gabriel looked at him, a lump in his throat. "That's because it wasn't true, Michael. They didn't really know you, but here, in this house, you have value and you always will." Michael nodded slowly, as if processing those words for the first time. "Thank you, Uncle Gabriel," he murmured, before leaning back in the armchair, visibly relaxing. That night, Gabriel couldn't help but think about how Michael had begun to trust him. On the 4th day, he received a call from the lab. The technician informed him that the results were ready and that he could pick them up at any time. Gabriel was sitting at his desk with the DNA test results still unopened on the table. He had spent hours contemplating them, torn between the need to know and the fear of the implications of that truth. His mind was consumed with this conflict when the sound of the doorbell interrupted his thoughts. Mrs. Wilson appeared shortly after at the door with a serious expression. "Sir Gabriel, there is a man at the entrance. He says he needs to speak with you urgently." "Did he give his name?" asked Gabriel, puzzled. "David," replied Renata. She didn't elaborate, but something in her tone made Gabriel uneasy. He decided to meet the visitor in the main hall. When he entered, he found a man in his 40s, dressed in worn but tidy clothes, with an attitude that combined arrogance and caution. David looked at him with a smile that didn't reach his eyes. "Thank you for seeing me, Sir Gabriel," he said, bowing slightly. "I hope I'm not wasting your time. What is it that you want?" Gabriel replied, his tone cold and direct. David settled into a chair without waiting for an invitation, crossing his legs calmly. "I know you have a boy living with you. Michael, right?" Gabriel's heart skipped a beat, but his expression remained unfazed. "What do you know about him?" he asked, his voice steady. "I know more than you think," David replied, leaning forward. "In fact, I'm here because I thought you might be interested in learning the truth about that boy. Of course, my memory might need a little incentive to become clearer." "Are you trying to blackmail me?" Gabriel asked, his voice tense. "Call it an exchange of valuable information for fair compensation," David said with a smile. Gabriel stood up, imposing his figure over the seated man. "If you have something to say it now. I don't have patience for games." David chuckled briefly and pulled an envelope from his jacket. He placed it on the table and pushed it toward Gabriel. Inside, you'll find documents proving how Michael ended up in the hands of those people in Brooklyn. I personally delivered him." The confession hit Gabriel like a physical blow. He grabbed the envelope and pulled out the papers, money receipts, and a list with descriptions of several children, including Michael. The document was crude, like an inventory of merchandise. "You sold him," Gabriel whispered, his voice full of anger. "If you want to see it that way, yes," David replied, unfazed. "But what's important isn't what I did. It's what could happen. You seem to have grown fond of that boy, but I advise you not to get too attached. His past is complicated, and there are people who would be interested in knowing where he is now." Gabriel felt his control nearly slip away. "What do you want?" he asked, his voice a low growl. 100,000 pesos, and my silence will be yours," David said, with a confidence that only irritated Gabriel further. Gabriel stared at him for several seconds, weighing every word. Finally, he leaned toward him. "Let me be clear, David. I don't care how much money you ask for, but if you try to hurt Michael or talk about this with anyone else, there will be no place where you can hide from me. Do you understand?" David seemed momentarily taken aback, but quickly regained his composure. "There's no need for threats, Sir Gabriel. I'm just a businessman." Gabriel called Javier from his mobile phone, asking him to prepare the money. "I want you to follow him after this, find out everything about him." David took the money when it arrived and stood up to leave. "It was a pleasure doing business with you. I hope we can maintain a good relationship." Gabriel didn't respond, watching as the man disappeared through the front door. He knew that the information he had just received was only the beginning of something much bigger. As he returned to his office, he took the envelope with the DNA results and opened it, determined to face the truth. Gabriel sat at his desk, the envelope in his hands. His breathing was heavy, as if the mere act of holding that paper filled him with an invisible weight. He sat surrounded by the evening's shadows, his eyes fixed on the corner of the envelope where his name was printed. Finally, with a decisive movement, he broke the seal and pulled out the sheets. His eyes scanned the first lines until he found the conclusion section, 99.9% probability of direct kinship. Gabriel let out a sigh that mixed disbelief, relief, and contained anger. Michael was his son. There was no room for doubt. The impact of the truth hit him hard. For years, he had lived convinced that he had lost his son in that tragic fire, but now he knew that the tragedy hadn't been an isolated accident. Someone had taken his son. Someone had manipulated his family's fate, and it all pointed to David. That same night, Gabriel called Javier to confirm David's whereabouts. His efficient lawyer had tracked the man to a humble house on the outskirts of the city. Without waiting for dawn, Gabriel got into his car and drove straight to the location. When he arrived, David was sitting on the porch, smoking a cigarette. Upon seeing Gabriel get out of the car, the man gave him a mocking smile. "Sir Gabriel, I didn't expect to see you so soon. Is there a problem with our agreement?" Gabriel walked toward him with firm steps, his eyes filled with contained fury that made David instinctively stand up. "You know exactly why I'm here," Gabriel said, his voice as cold as steel. "The boy you sold me, the boy you had the audacity to traffic, is my son." David blinked in surprise but quickly regained his composure. "That explains a lot," he said casually, which only further enraged Gabriel. "I want answers," Gabriel continued, stepping closer until he was face to face with the man. "I want to know how you separated him from Emily. I want to know what role you played in all of this." David let out a nervous laugh and raised his hands in a gesture of surrender. "All right, Sir Gabriel, I'll tell you everything, but I warn you, the truth might not be something you like." In a more serious tone, David began to recount the events. Years ago, after the fire, I was working for people who handled delicate matters. They asked me to check the remains of Emily House. When I arrived, she was unconscious, and the baby, well, he was still alive. My boss saw an opportunity and ordered me to take the child. It was a simple deal. Separate him from his mother and find a family to take care of him until he could be sold. And why didn't Emily do anything? Why didn't she fight for her son? Gabriel interrupted, his voice filled with bitterness. Because she never knew the truth, David replied. They told her the baby died in the fire. She believed that for years. But Sir Gabriel, there's something else you need to know. What else could you possibly tell me that wouldn't already destroy you? Gabriel responded, clenching his fists. David looked directly at him, this time without any trace of mockery. Emily is alive. The impact of those words left Gabriel motionless for a moment. He wasn't sure if he had heard right. What did you say? Emily is alive? He repeated. After the fire, she disappeared. She didn't want to stay close to her old life, and for good reason. The people who hired me were also after her. She went into hiding, and as far as I know, she's still alive. I could even tell you where to find her if the price is right. Gabriel grabbed David by the shirt, lifting him off the ground. If you're lying to me, I swear you won't live to see another day. I'm not lying, David insisted, a mix of fear and defiance in his eyes. But if you want to find her, you'll need to act fast. She doesn't trust anyone, and if she finds out that she's being looked for, she could disappear for good. Gabriel released him with a shove. His thoughts were in chaos. He had recovered his son, but now he was facing a new uncertainty, the possibility of finding Emily and facing everything that the truth entailed. Gabriel parked his car in front of a small house on the outskirts of a remote village. He had driven through the night, driven by David's revelation. Emily was alive. The echo of those words still reverberated in his mind as he looked at the modest house, his heart pounding. By his side, Michael was sleeping soundly, exhausted from the journey. For a moment, Gabriel hesitated. He didn't know how Emily would react to seeing him after so many years, and especially to discovering that the child she had mourned as lost was now here with him. Finally, he gathered his courage, got out of the car, and knocked on the door. The wait felt endless, but finally the door opened. There stood Emily, thinner, with the marks of the years on her face, but with the same eyes Gabriel remembered. When she saw him, her hands trembled and her expression shifted from surprise to confusion. "Gabriel, is it you?" she whispered, as if fearing that it might be an illusion. "Yes, Emily, it's me," Gabriel replied, his voice firm but restrained by emotion. "We need to talk. It's important." Emily stood still for a moment, trying to process the situation. Finally, she opened the door completely and invited him in. Gabriel returned to the car and carried Michael, who woke up confused, into the house. The interior of the house was simple, decorated modestly but with care. Emily led them to the living room, where they all sat down. Michael, still half asleep, huddled close to Gabriel, watching Emily with curiosity and a little wariness. "Why are you here?" Emily asked, breaking the silence. Her tone was tense, as if she feared the answer. Gabriel took a deep breath before responding. "Emily, there's something you need to know. Something I didn't dare imagine until recently. Michael is our son." Emily froze, her eyes filling with tears as she heard those words. "That can't be. My baby. They told me my baby died in the fire. They took him from me. I couldn't save him." "They lied to you, Emily," Gabriel said, his voice gentle but firm. "It was David. He was involved with a network that separated children from their families to sell them. They took our son that night, and I had no idea." Emily's breathing became erratic, and tears started to fall down her face. Her gaze turned to Michael, who now looked at her with a mix of confusion and fear. "Is it true?" he asked, as if needing confirmation of reality. Gabriel nodded firmly. "I had a DNA test done. There's no doubt. Michael is our son. He's here, Emily, with you after all this time." Emily leaned toward Michael, who recoiled slightly, unsure of how to react. You are my baby?" she asked, her voice trembling. Michael averted his gaze, overwhelmed by the intensity of the moment. "I don't know. I don't know what's happening," he said in a trembling voice, seeking refuge in Gabriel. Gabriel placed a hand on the boy's shoulder, trying to calm him. "Michael, she is your mom. All these years she thought she had lost you, but she never stopped looking for you. That's why we're here." Emily, unable to contain herself, knelt in front of Michael, tears streaming down her face. "I'm so sorry, my love. I never wanted to leave you. I thought I had lost you forever, but now you're here, and I'll never let you go again." Michael, still confused, extended a hand toward her, touching her carefully, as if afraid the child would disappear. The calm of the village was shattered by a loud noise in the night. Gabriel, who had been resting in the living room after a long day adjusting to the new family dynamic, jumped up upon hearing the noise. Emily appeared in the doorway with a pale face. "What was that?" she asked, her voice laden with concern. Michael, who was asleep in one of the rooms, didn't realize the imminent danger. Gabriel, now on high alert, grabbed a lamp and ran outside. The moon faintly illuminated the garden, but in the shadows, he noticed a figure trying to approach the window of Michael's room. "Stop right now!" Gabriel shouted, running toward him. David turned, his face showing a mixture of surprise and defiance. "Stay out of this, Gabriel. This has nothing to do with you." "That child is my son, David, and I'm not going to let you touch him," Gabriel replied, advancing with firm steps. Without wasting any time, David pulled a knife from his jacket, threatening Gabriel with the shiny blade. "You don't understand, do you? If he talks, my life ends, and I'm not going to let that happen." Emily, who had followed Gabriel from the house, ran toward Michael's room, locking the door and embracing the boy, who woke up frightened by the commotion. "Calm down, Michael. I'm here. No one is going to hurt you," she told him, although her own voice trembled. Gabriel tried to keep David away from the house. "All of this can be resolved," he said, as the situation escalated to a dangerous confrontation. David's eyes widened in surprise, but he quickly regained his composure. "That explains a lot," he said in a casual tone that only enraged Gabriel further. "I want answers," Gabriel continued, stepping closer until he was face to face with the man. "I want to know how you separated him from Emily. I want to know what role you played in all of this." David let out a nervous laugh and raised his hands in a sign of surrender. "All right, Sir Gabriel, I'll tell you everything, but I warn you the truth might not be something you like." In a more serious tone, David began to recount the events. "Years ago, after the fire, I was working for people who handled delicate matters. They asked me to check the remains of Emily House. When I arrived, she was unconscious, and the baby, well, he was still alive. My boss saw an opportunity and ordered me to take the child. It was a simple deal. Separate him from his mother and find a family to take care of him until he could be sold." "And why didn't Emily do anything? Why didn't she fight for her son?" Gabriel interrupted, his voice full of bitterness. "Because she never knew the truth," David replied. "They told her the baby died in the fire. She believed that for years. But Sir Gabriel, there's something else you need to know." "What else could you possibly tell me that wouldn't already destroy you?" Gabriel responded, clenching his fists. David looked directly at him, this time without any trace of mockery. "Emily is alive." The impact of those words left Gabriel motionless for a moment. He wasn't sure if he had heard right. "What did you say?" "Emily's alive?" he repeated. After the fire, she disappeared. She didn't want to stay close to her old life, and for good reason. The people who hired me were also after her. She went into hiding, and as far as I know, she's still alive. I could even tell you where to find her, if the price is right. Gabriel grabbed David by the shirt, lifting him off the ground. "If you're lying to me, I swear you won't live to see another day." "I'm not lying," David insisted, a mix of fear and defiance in his eyes. "But if you want to find her, you'll need to act fast. She doesn't trust anyone, and if she finds out that she's being looked for, she could disappear for good." Gabriel released him with a shove. His thoughts were in chaos. He had recovered his son, but now he was facing a new uncertainty, the possibility of finding Emily and facing everything that the truth entailed. Gabriel parked his car in front of a small house on the outskirts of a remote village. He had driven through the night, driven by David's revelation. Emily was alive. The echo of those words still reverberated in his mind as he looked at the modest house, his heart pounding. By his side, Michael was sleeping soundly, exhausted from the journey. For a moment, Gabriel hesitated. He didn't know how Emily would react to seeing him after so many years, and especially to discovering that the child she had mourned as lost was now here with him. Finally, he gathered his courage, got out of the car, and knocked on the door. The wait felt endless, but finally the door opened. There stood Emily, thinner with the marks of the years on her face, but with the same eyes Gabriel remembered. When she saw him, her hands trembled, and her expression shifted from surprise to confusion. "Gabriel, is it you?" she whispered, as if fearing that it might be an illusion. "Yes, Emily, it's me," Gabriel replied, his voice firm but restrained by emotion. "We need to talk. It's important." Emily stood still for a moment, trying to process the situation. Finally, she opened the door completely and invited him in. Gabriel returned to the car and carried Michael, who woke up confused, into the house. The interior of the house was simple, decorated modestly but with care. Emily led them to the living room, where they all sat down. Michael, still half asleep, huddled close to Gabriel, watching Emily with curiosity and a little wariness. "Why are you here?" Emily asked, breaking the silence. Her tone was tense, as if she feared the answer. Gabriel took a deep breath before responding. "Emily, there's something you need to know, something I didn't dare imagine until recently. Michael is our son." Emily froze, her eyes filling with tears as she heard those words. "That can't be. My baby. They told me my baby died in the fire. They took him from me. I couldn't save him." "They lied to you, Emily," Gabriel said, his voice gentle but firm. "It was David. He was involved with a network that separated children from their families to sell them. They took our son that night, and I had no idea." Emily's breathing became erratic, and tears started to fall down her face. Her gaze turned to Michael, who now looked at her with a mix of confusion and fear. "Is it true?" he asked, as if needing confirmation of reality. Gabriel nodded firmly. "I had a DNA test done. There's no doubt. Michael is our son. He's here, Emily, with you after all this time." Emily leaned toward Michael, who recoiled slightly, unsure of how to react. You are my baby," she asked, her voice trembling. Michael averted his gaze, overwhelmed by the intensity of the moment. I don't know what's happening," he said in a trembling voice, seeking refuge in Gabriel. Gabriel placed a hand on the boy's shoulder, trying to calm him. "Michael, she is your mum. All these years, she thought she had lost you, but she never stopped looking for you. That's why we're here." Emily, unable to contain herself, knelt in front of Michael, tears streaming down her face. "I'm so sorry, my love. I never wanted to leave you. I thought I had lost you forever, but now you're here, and I'll never let you go again." Michael, still confused, extended a hand toward her, touching her carefully, as if afraid the child would disappear. The calm of the village was shattered by a loud noise in the night. Gabriel, who had been resting in the living room after a long day adjusting to the new family dynamic, jumped up upon hearing the noise. Emily appeared in the doorway with a pale face. "What was that?" she asked, her voice laden with concern. Michael, who was asleep in one of the rooms, didn't realize the imminent danger. Gabriel, now on high alert, grabbed a lamp and ran outside. The moon faintly illuminated the garden, but in the shadows he noticed a figure trying to approach the window of Michael's room. "Stop right now!" Gabriel shouted, running toward him. David turned, his face showing a mixture of surprise and defiance. "Stay out of this, Gabriel. This has nothing to do with you. That child is my son, David, and I'm not going to let you touch him," Gabriel replied, advancing with firm steps. Without wasting any time, David pulled a knife from his jacket, threatening Gabriel with the shiny blade. "You don't understand, do you? If he talks, my life ends, and I'm not going to let that happen." Emily, who had followed Gabriel from the house, ran toward Michael's room, locking the door and embracing the boy, who woke up frightened by the commotion. "Calm down, Michael. I'm here. No one is going to hurt you," she told him, although her own voice trembled. Gabriel tried to keep David away from the house. "All of this can be resolved," he said, as the situation escalated to a dangerous confrontation. "The only thing that matters is that we are together," Gabriel thought to himself. The house they had found was small, nestled in a quiet village, surrounded by fields, with a garden where Michael could play freely. Though humble, the house soon filled with laughter and warmth. At first, Michael, confused by the changes, began to adapt quickly, enjoying the closeness of his mother and the protection of Gabriel in the new life they had built. The nights were simple but full of meaning. They would sit together in the small living room, sharing stories and dreams for the future. Gabriel, still dealing with the aftermath of his wound, found comfort in the peace he now felt. One day, while they were walking through the countryside, Michael took Gabriel's and Emily's hands, looking at them with a shy smile. "Thank you for bringing me here," he said with a sincerity that left both adults speechless. Gabriel, his heart full, replied, "You are the one who brought us here, Michael. I don't know what would have happened to me without you." The morning sun gently lit the small house in the countryside, surrounded by rolling hills and wildflowers. Michael was in the garden, kneeling beside a small vegetable patch he had helped plant with Gabriel and Emily. His hands were covered in dirt as he proudly inspected the first carrot shoots that were beginning to sprout. Emily, from the kitchen window, watched him with a smile. There was something about the tranquility of the moment that made all the past suffering seem distant, almost unreal. Gabriel walked out of the house, a cup of coffee in hand, his pace slower than usual due to the wound he was still recovering from. "How are the plants, Michael?" he asked as he approached his son. "Good, Dad. I think these will be the biggest ones in the garden," Michael answered with a broad smile, showing his dirty hands with pride. Gabriel knelt beside him, ignoring the sharp pain in his side. "I'm sure they will. You have a good hand for this," he said. Michael looked at him for a moment, then with a more serious tone asked, "Do you think I'll be able to take care of all this someday, like you do?" Gabriel set the cup aside and placed a hand on the boy's shoulder. "I have no doubt, Michael. You're strong. And you won't have to do it alone. We'll always be here with you." Michael nodded, satisfied with the response, and returned to focusing on his plants. Inside the house, Emily was preparing breakfast. The kitchen was small, but filled with light, decorated with details she had chosen herself. There was a calendar on the wall with the days marked by Michael, reminders of garden tasks and drawings the boy had made on the edges. On the table, there were fresh flowers that Gabriel picked every morning, a habit he had adopted to brighten the day. When breakfast was ready, Emily called both Gabriel and Michael. The boy entered proudly, carrying a small flower he had picked from the garden. "This is for you, Mom," he said, extending it to Emily with a smile that could melt any heart. "Thank you, my love. It's beautiful," Emily replied, taking the flower and placing it in a small vase next to the others. The three sat at the table, and as they ate, they talked about their plans for the day. Michael wanted to build a scarecrow for the garden, something he had seen in a book that Gabriel had given him. Emily suggested they go together to the village market to buy the necessary things, a weekly activity that always ended with Michael receiving a small treat or handmade toy. In the afternoon, after finishing the day's chores, the three of them went for a walk in the nearby hills. Michael ran ahead, exploring every corner, while Gabriel and Emily walked at a steady pace, hand in hand. "Do you regret everything we left behind?" Emily asked, breaking the silence. "Not for a second," Gabriel answered sincerely. "What we have here is more valuable than anything money could buy." Emily smiled, resting her head on Gabriel's shoulder as they walked. From where they were, they could see Michael playing with a stick, imagining himself as a knight facing dragons. His laughter echoed in the air, filling both of their hearts with a sense of completeness they had never known. When they returned home, the evening light bathed everything in a golden hue. Michael had fallen asleep on the couch, while Emily and Gabriel watched him in silence. "After everything that happened, I can't believe we finally have this," Emily said, her voice full of gratitude. Gabriel embraced her softly. "We have it because we never stopped fighting, and now it's our turn to give him the life he always deserved." That night, as the stars shone brightly in the clear sky, Gabriel sat on the porch with Emily, enjoying the calm. It wasn't a luxurious life, but it was their life, and for the first time in a long time, they felt complete.